Hello and welcome to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I are joined by Hannah Cross. Hannah has been on the show several times. For those of you who are new to the show, she introduces herself to you at the beginning of the episode. We had Hannah on today to discuss non-medical uses of psychedelics. The show is called Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, but historically, psychedelics have been used for a variety of reasons that are not strictly medicinal, like creative problem solving, artistic creativity, spiritual worship, cultural ceremony, consciousness expansion, and many more. Really grateful to Hannah for coming on and helping Reid and I discuss this topic. Quick plug for the unique training opportunities that Numinus has for mental health practitioners who want to develop an expertise in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinus professionals and offer high-quality learning experiences. So if you'd like to learn more about these trainings, you can find the link in the show notes below, or you can visit numinus.com/training. That's numinus.com/training. If you'd like to support our show, you can do that by subscribing to the show on whatever podcast player you're using to listen to the show. You can leave us a review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and you can share the episode. Without further ado, here's our conversation with Hannah Cross. You know what? The name of our podcast is called Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. So naturally, on the show, we talk a lot about how psychedelics, the chemicals, the plants, the compounds, the alkaloids, how they can be used to treat mental health conditions or mental illnesses. But I think historically, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that hasn't necessarily been the way that they've been used. And they are used today by many, many people, millions of people, not necessarily to treat trauma or to treat depression, not as a treatment, but for other reasons. And I don't think, this is kind of why we decided to record today, to actually go into. So we brought on the intrepid Hannah Cross. For any of you who are new to the podcast, this is like your fourth time maybe on the show, something like that?
Fourth or fifth?
Yeah. So for those folks who haven't met you yet, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we will dive headfirst into this wacky topic.
Sure. My name's Hannah Cross. I'm a LCSW and therapist by trade or profession. The work that I do with Numinus is mostly on our psychedelic clinical trials. I do some psychedelic integration work, and I also have a private practice. And happy to be back on this podcast. It's always been a blast.
Yeah. And of course, Reid's still here.
Thanks, Steve. It's a fun topic. I'm excited, though, because I agree with you. Even though we call this Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, it is definitely not all about therapy. And I think there is a risk of focusing too much on the therapy work, the processing, the pathology, the healing, but what about the growth? What about the thriving and the expansion and self-realization?
Expansion of consciousness, creativity, spiritual exploration. Yeah, lots of different reasons people use psychedelics.
Yeah, I like that you brought up this word processing. I was thinking about that before coming into this podcast. A lot of times we think about processing in terms of processing trauma or the healing work or going into the shadows, but processing also refers to learning, filing away information that we're taking in on a daily basis so that we can use it. And like my personal opinion is hopefully use it for the good of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good of ourselves, good of humanity. And I think, we pulled a little bit of some of recent research on psychedelics and creativity. We've got some stories to share. But I think today we're just going to explore generally the ways in which psychedelics have been used for, not necessarily for treatment or processing in that sort of trauma processing way, but the ways they've been used in these other myriad ways. Now, last episode we talked about legalization, decriminalization. We understand that a lot of this consciousness expansion work with psychedelics is happening illicitly, at least in the United States. So with that caveat, we don't encourage the use of illicit substance, but we also have expressed strong opinions about how these compounds, these medicines, these drugs, having been made illegal was a huge mistake.
Yeah. Lately, Hannah and I both have been diving into some of the literature from the 50s, 60s, when these things were not illegal yet. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is, for the most part, they also weren't socially acceptable. So, I think there's a lot we can learn from the other Renaissance that we can apply to today. But just a couple fun facts come to mind that we may have talked about in here, but in the 50s and 60s, there were a ton of discoveries and important insights made while on psychedelics, including 2 Nobel Prizes. Mm-hmm. Like we've talked about the discovery of the double helical structure of DNA and the invention of PCR. Carrie Mullis apparently was like driving along the coastal highway one night on LSD and had this kind of vision of how to replicate DNA and made it into a machine that won the Nobel Prize.
Yeah. Yeah, and he was asked, I think, in a BBC interview, like, do you think you would have come up with PCR if it weren't for LSD? And he said, no, I don't think I would have. So he basically attributing the discovery, the invention of this really important test to his psychedelic use.
Yeah, and another one that's worth just reading because it's a good quote is from Steve Jobs. He said, taking LSD was a profound experience, one of the most important things in my life. LSD shows you that there's another side to the coin, and you can't remember it when it wears off, but you know it. It reinforced my sense of what was important.
I've also heard that Steve Jobs accused Bill Gates of being unimaginative because he didn't use LSD. But I guess Bill Gates did use LSD, but I guess not to make Windows 95 or whatever. But
you want to hear a Tim Leary story about his first LSD trip?
Do I? Okay. Yes, I do.
Timothy Leary, he likes to be called, I guess. Okay. This is from his book, High Priest, where he wrote, we, meaning Leary and Alpert, a.k.a. Richard Dick Alpert Ram Dass, had moved beyond the game of psychology, the game of trying to help people, and beyond the game of conventional love relationships. We were quietly and serenely aware of too much. I've never recovered from that shattering ontological confrontation. I've never been able to take myself, my mind, and the social world around me seriously. From the date of this session, it was inevitable that we would leave Harvard, that we would leave American society, tenderly, gently, disregarding the parochial. Sorry, I don't normally botch words.
You can be forgiven.
Social inanities. So then Ram Dass writes, when Tim first took LSD, he didn't speak for weeks. I went around saying, we've lost Timothy. I was warning everybody not to take the drug as Tim wasn't talking. But Timothy Leary said his first LSD was the most shattering experience of his life. Mm.
Mm. Yeah, I think I'm happy that you brought this up, and it kind of maybe speaks to Steve's disclaimer of that, like, we're talking about this, but we also want to like err on the side of caution and not encourage people to explore consciousness without some awareness and safety. Also from the era of Tim Leary is Robert Anton Wilson, author, comic, starseed, philosopher of that era that I really admire. He talks about in his consciousness explorations entering this really challenging period of time that he calls chapel perilous. And he warns, he's like, if you do this kind of exploration, you're going to end up in chapel perilous. And it's challenging, and you can have the support and hopefully the skills and the knowledge to move through it, or not. And I think, it's something to be aware of, is that Tim Leary probably had some support through this time. At least I hope so. Made it to the other side and was okay. But
what is chapel perilous?
I think another way of looking at it would be like the dark night of the soul, or those times in your consciousness exploration where your old models are being broken down, and it's scary and disorienting. And there might also be some weirdness or some strange phenomenon happening. Like one of the ones that Robert Anton Wilson talks about is this experience of channeling beings from the star Sirius, and he's like, how do I interpret this? Do I believe in it or not? And, he ultimately concludes that he doesn't believe in anything. But that would maybe be like a challenging experience for a lot of people.
Yeah. I think it'd be really challenging if I had, if I was pretty convinced while on a psychedelic that I was receiving messages from a star millions of light years away. And then after becoming sober from that experience, like now doubting the conviction that I have. Conviction is something that to my sort of quote unquote normal conscious mind sounds like complete insanity.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of people get to that place and, maybe develop that heaviness of meaninglessness and purposelessness, like what even is real? And he is such a good example of somebody that walked through that and ended up on the other side going, don't believe any of it, embrace it all, like it's all true. Whatever model you want to choose, have a ball choosing what model appeals to you or is the most humorous.
Yeah, I like how Robert Anton Wilson has a dozen or more ways of looking at any situation. Like he could just see perspectives, and it's kind of like Steve Jobs was saying, the other side of the coin, or one thing psychedelics do is expand your ability to perceive other ways of looking at a given thing. Like there are even brain studies to support it, but I just love how he kind of outlines all these possibilities, even the weird ones, and just recognizes that he doesn't know absolute truth.
And would you call that psychological flexibility? Like you're the ACT psychologist. Would you equate that to psychological flexibility?
Yeah, psychological flexibility and cognitive diffusion, right? Where we take beliefs that have been fused together and we defuse them, to use the ACT terminology, like pull them apart, which is kind of what psychedelics seem to do. They allow for divergent thinking, right? They allow for creativity and novel thought generation. And if anybody has ever had a psychedelic, they probably had the experience of having this thought that if you put a gun to the head, they would have never generated on their own meaning in normal waking consciousness. And this sense of its profundity, like, oh my gosh, I've just figured out the secrets of the universe. So there's this conviction that this novel thought, this creative thought that they have is really, really important. But some of the research suggests that conviction kind of goes away once normal thinking patterns return and your prefrontal cortex is more online, that default mode comes back online, and you engage analytical or convergent thinking. It's like, oh, I think, I'm looking at my journal entries from when I was on psilocybin, and I think that thought probably wasn't as profound as I thought it was, but it was still novel. Like it was still very, very unique. And I don't think that happens without psychological flexibility. We've talked a lot about on the show why psychological flexibility might help with the treatment of conditions like OCD or eating disorders or depression or PTSD. But, if psychological flexibility is important for creativity, then we can make the argument that psychedelics could help a person be more creative in the sense that they could generate novel, out-of-the-box, new types of thoughts. Whether or not those ideas are super useful to them or society would be up for debate for each particular thought, but at least it helps us think outside the box.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this conversation because we, like you said, we know that psychological flexibility increasing is why the psychedelic experience, in particular the mystical experience, helps for things like depression and anxiety and eating disorders and PTSD. But yeah, what does psychological flexibility do for human beings in general? It's a fun thing to think about. Yeah,
and it's not an unmitigated good either. Like, don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. I remember hearing somebody say that once. And we've talked about the entropic brain and Robin Carhart Harris's thing about, on one end of the spectrum where it's so flexible that you have something like schizophrenia, where you're, but again, even using terms like schizophrenia, well, never mind. I'm not going to go into that. Go ahead, Reid.
It's an interesting one. Like at the risk of returning to therapy and pathologizing, and that's not the conversation. I do like sometimes to plot states of consciousness on the spectrum of order to chaos or rigidity to entropy, where, on one end you could plot things like schizophrenia, but you could also call it magical thinking. You could also call it psychedelics inducing a state of like brain desynchronization or more entropy and toning down the default mode so you can fire new connections, new ideas that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And some, like you said, might be good, some might not. But that brings up another way that some people use psychedelics for non-therapy reasons is art. Like look at Alex Gray and his DMT art, or look at all the art and brilliant creative ideas that have come from it.
Yeah, music as art too, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of really, really revolutionizing and popular songs and music genres that the musicians have attributed to their use of psychedelics. I heard that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds actually isn't about LSD, or are we sure that it is? I'm gonna have to Google this later.
Oh no.
Anyway, yeah, influential in a lot of bands. I mean, I remember reading how important cannabis use was. I mean, this is no shock to anybody, but to Bob Marley, not only culturally in Rastafarianism, like sacramentally, but also creatively for music.
And I think on the music front, it's interesting to look at the shamanic traditions and the use of medicine, whether it's in like ayahuasca in Peru or the Amazon, or iboga and rites of passage in the Bwiti tribes, but how much both the medicine and the music played this role. Like it might be shamanic drumming that could by itself induce an altered state. I mean, they're one and the same, and psychedelics aren't necessary for these, but for many they were like catalysts, just like we talk about them as catalysts for the therapy, catalysts for the rite of passage or for the exploration of the cosmos and all sorts of things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm thinking of other ways that psychedelics are used, not necessarily medically, and you hear a lot about communities like the tech folks in Silicon Valley, people in industry who maybe used to snort cocaine to do their work, and now maybe they're taking Adderall and things like Provigil to do their work. But now we hear things like everyone's microdosing because microdosing is supposed to, theoretically, purportedly supposed to help with creativity, with divergent thinking. And then they're going to be able to come up with these new creative solutions to specific problems. And I think we've talked about microdosing a little bit on the show before, and the state of the science isn't super supportive of microdosing increasing creativity necessarily, but we have a lot of anecdotal reports from people that, microdosing things like psilocybin or LSD helps them think more laterally. And for some people even that microdosing helps them with motivation and energy, not only creativity.
I was just going to add to that, just helping with presence and mindfulness might also be enough to unlock a new skill or have a creative insight or be able to do a yoga pose that you haven't been able to do for 10 years.
Haven't we heard that? I think we've mentioned it a couple of times. Was it Andy Weil?
Yeah, when he was at Harvard in the 60s. He was younger than Ram Dass and Timothy Leary, but still there. Like he was the one who was head of the newsletter and wrote the article about the psychedelic studies that actually got them in trouble and eventually kicked out, even though he wasn't intending to have that consequence. It was like part of the path. But he was getting into yoga. And as a bigger build guy, if you see videos of Andrew Weil, this big fella, like teddy bear of a fella with a big beard, like Steve's, but white. And he was practicing yoga as an undergrad and trying to do, what the plow pose is?
You described it to me once, but now I forgot.
You're laying on the ground and your feet go up over your head and they try and touch the ground behind your head.
Okay. So like you're prone on your back and you're lifting your feet up over your head.
Like if you know what shoulder stand is, it's dropping your feet to the ground behind your head in shoulder stand. But he wanted his feet to get to the ground and plow, like a full expression of it. But he couldn't until he took LSD, and then they found the ground. But then the next day he's like, let me see if I can do that. He couldn't. And he takes LSD a week later, he could. But that was enough. It was enough of a way shower or a confidence instiller that he could just keep doing the work. And, I've experienced that in some ways.
Yeah, I love this idea. Psychedelics as a way shower to a skill or an ability and a confidence builder in it. And I'm thinking about MDMA, for example, and the experience of real fearless communication and connection that it can facilitate. And perhaps once, let's say, a couple has been shown that way, they may be able to then access that skill or remember what that was like and embody that.
Yeah, I've used the metaphor of dropping breadcrumbs on your way out of a psychedelic experience so that you can follow them back to this connection, this insight, this new way of being that wouldn't come to you necessarily spontaneously, or would be hard to recreate in the days following a psychedelic experience.
Yeah, so we're talking about the state it brings of toning down like the ego structures so you can make new connections, like shaking up the brain synchrony a bit so it's like more creatively chaotic, and combine that with neuroplasticity, like this opening up a window of speedy learning, versus the opposite. Like if you study cocaine in a lab, you'll see hyperplasticity. But it's interesting to think about what you said about microdosing or just psychedelic dosing and creativity, and something like people take Adderall to get things done. Like that puts you into a mode, like that dopamine of just doing, carrying out the tasks. So you can see how some people actually take breaks from their stimulant to have more creative ideas, and then get back on it and just get it done, you know?
Yeah, and I've heard people who maybe by disposition are pretty hard charging. You know, they're very goal-oriented and they're used to getting things done, maybe even without the help of a stimulant, who will then have an experience with psychedelics, and it's sort of shattering for them, because it's like, all of a sudden, I don't really care to do this deal, or I don't really care to get this degree or to score this many points or whatever. They're put back on their heels in this state of reflection, and it's potentially very useful for them, but it's also very, very distressing, because they're used to being pulled along by their ambition.
Yeah, their striving mode. Yeah, and psychedelics can kind of loosen that or dissolve some of that, and it can be jarring. I've seen it in many people. I've experienced it somewhat, where the pendulum swings almost into too zen of a category. There may not be such a thing as too zen, but it can feel jarring when you're used to hustling, and then all of a sudden you're like, you know, the end goal doesn't matter. It's all okay. And it takes some readjusting. It ties back into what we were saying earlier about beware of unearned wisdom, like Carl Jung says, or be ready for the shakeup if you're going to go down this rabbit hole.
And I could hear in my mind some people making the argument that is precisely what we would want psychedelics to do in a culture like Western culture is now. You know, I can't remember who to attribute this phrase to, but and I'm going to butcher it exactly, but it's something like adjustment to a sick society is not a good measure of wellness, right?
Krishnamurti.
There you go. And I'm sure I didn't quote it exactly, but that's the general idea, right? And so the fact that we are in sort of this very recent, in terms of the entirety of human existence, or even in human culture, like modern human cultures, this very recent application of strive, do, accomplish, accumulate. I'm totally losing my train of thought, but it in itself might not necessarily be really helpful. So, or conducive to what is naturally healthy for human consciousness. We'll put it that way. So we're using psychedelics sometimes as treatments for, I'm using air quotes here, folks who aren't watching the YouTube video, as treatments for illnesses that are the result of a failure to adapt to maybe a way of living that isn't really, really good for us in the first place.
Yeah, it makes me think of that one use of psychedelics, the big overarching one, in my opinion, of self-realization, so like awareness of self and your place in the universe. Like there are these studies about psychedelics increasing nature connectedness. I'm even reading a book now by Metzner called The Ecology of Consciousness, and that is a result of psychedelics. As you see your impact on nature, you see your relationship with other people essentially mindfulness, occasionally more mindfulness of your interbeing and how you walk through the earth, that is so needed in this like hurried society where we're just mindlessly consuming and even destroying, you know. So speaking of sick society, you want to hear another Timothy Leary quote about his explanation of turn on, tune in, drop out, the classic saying that he would rally the people around. That I think is good to visit in this context, because he was seeing psychedelics as a way to like see more clearly, like raise consciousness and question societal conditioning, right? So he says, this is in his autobiography, Flashbacks. Turn on meant go within to activate your neural and genetic equipment, become sensitive to the many various levels of consciousness and the specific triggers engage in them. Drugs were one way to accomplish this end. Tune in meant interact harmoniously with the world around you. Externalize, materialize, express your new internal perspectives. Drop out suggested an active, selective, graceful process of detachment from our involuntary or unconscious commitments. Drop out meant self-reliance, a discovery of one's singularity, a commitment to mobility, choice, and change. Unhappily, my explanations of this sequence of personal development are often misinterpreted to mean get stoned and abandon all constructive activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what he really means is free yourself from the mental restraints.
Yeah, and I'm glad you read that, because I'm afraid to admit I had never looked closely at his intent for that phrase, and especially the drop out part. I had always kind of assumed he was just saying like, disconnect from society, don't go to war, man, in true like 60s fashion, which I guess is what it was criticized for. Like, use psychedelics to drop out of society and just become hedonistic and selfish.
Right. And there's maybe potential for that, right? Mm-hmm. Like when the emphasis is on transcending this world here and then continually doing that. I've been thinking quite a bit lately around this, and this is a ketamine insight, honestly, that there are these like realms of existence. There's this spiritual realm, and then there's this physical realm, and there's maybe even realms within that are like hurt past realms. But the ability to move between those so that you can affect change in this physical world, I think would probably be a good goal of this kind of work, outside of the treatment of mental health, quote, disorders or pathologies. How do I learn from maybe these other realms, the transpersonal realms, where, yeah, I have a transcendence of my normal sense of self so that I can then, in my normal waking state of consciousness, help free the oppressed, including myself. Mm-hmm.
You know, it reminds me of one thing I've personally gotten out of psychedelics is an additional way of looking at life and my role in it. Like seeing the different channels, like seeing the other side of the coin. I remember one of my first profound psychedelic experiences ever. I traveled to this like conference, and I was on the cusp of starting a new path, opening a new clinic, this new business venture with a couple partners. And I'll admit, in hindsight, it wasn't sitting totally comfortably with me at the time, but I wasn't totally attuned to that. But after this journey, the next morning, I get up with this colleague friend who was with me on that adventure, and I get my badge on to go into the conference and start walking in. I still remember it clearly, these double doors to go in, and there's this like just sea of people sitting in there ready for the presentation, and I just stop. It's like I hit a force field, this wall at the door where I could not go in, I'm just sitting there like dumbfounded. Take my badge off, chuck it in the garbage, and we just, my friend was nice enough to come to brunch with me. We just sat there. I like shed many tears about like the sorrows of society, and just like recalibrated to not the easy path, not the money-making path, the path that aligned, you know?
Yeah, I think we see that with some of even our research participants, right? Where they have this new level of sensitivity after their experience that makes some things now unacceptable to them. Thankfully, a lot of the times those things are the things that, are destructive in some way.
Yeah, it reminds me of something you were saying the other day after a particularly difficult, hard, intense yoga class of just being really sensitive. Like you can almost feel emotions more clearly, forces at play in the universe, intuition signals, and just like Timothy Leary in that quote said, psychedelics are one way of doing this. But for me, I lump it into like a deep, dedicated meditation practice, yoga practice, all these other ways of getting outside of oneself and clearing the layers of stuff that gets stuck on us in society, so you can like really open your heart again. You can feel like your intuition. You can feel your inner compass and really see the impact of what we're doing in life and act in a more inspired and gentle way.
Maybe a way, too, that's more connected to the body signals. I see this a lot with my clients and even in my own life, is this reconnection with, here's just an example, with hunger. Like, what is my body actually communicating to me that it's hungry for? And can I honor that? And maybe that's a type of food, but maybe that's also sunshine and movement.
It is interesting, the psychedelic experiences I've had, I've never craved Oreos. Like I've never craved, Skittles. I always come out of those experiences just, I was taking your hunger comment literally, but like, you know what I need? I need vegetables, and I need like actual animal protein and water. Oh, I just need water. Maybe a little salt in there. Yeah, I need to be cleansed. But also thinking creatively about other types of hunger, attachment, desire. Like I won't go down that particular road, but there was something else you said, and maybe it was a combination of what you and Reid said. I think sometimes the opening of the creative doors can be a really, really unpleasant experience. And, Timothy Leary not talking for 2 weeks maybe was a result of that. I don't want to give people the impression that, you can use psychedelics and it's going to be this blissful, unending conveyor belt of insights. Just these orgasmic insights that she's coming, and it's so pleasant, right? Sometimes I think he described the ontological shock, like what's real all of a sudden shifts, and that can be really destabilizing and terrifying. And I liked Reid's word of alignment. Like you learned that the path that you were on wasn't necessarily in alignment with something, with who you really are, or some core self or a value or something like that. Such a valuable insight, but also can be like a terrifying insight. What are the implications of that? Especially for a career or for relationships or for what I'm doing with my time or for where our position in the universe. It can be really, really destabilizing. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm just thankful that you spoke to that, because I think that it's not emphasized enough, honestly. And that's Chapel Perilous experience, the opening of the creative doors, the increase in psychological flexibility, the downloads of all of these other possible models that could explain the world we're seeing. Like, yeah, that can be really destabilizing. And for me, a lot of times the creativity comes after like a good humbling dose of depression or loneliness, and feeling kind of that dark night of the soul. But that is a lot of times with the support. Like, I just want to emphasize support so much, with the support, where sometimes those disorienting experiences can then be channeled into something that is creative or that can help others.
Yeah. And that story I was telling about an early psychedelic experience and that shift in path. Thinking back on it, this friend gave me lots of good and very important warnings beforehand. Is like, Like, you take a medicine like this, it's ripping blinders off, and that's not more pleasant. It's not easier. It's like, and you can't unsee necessarily. Like, you can start to numb out, and people certainly go back into their old ways, but I really appreciate that reminder. And another component that what Hannah just mentioned made me think of is the importance of equanimity in this, or the preparation and tools to support it. Because as I was thinking about this episode and this topic, and I was just scribbling, free associating ways psychedelics have helped me, or I've seen them through the ages, and in other people, help in a non-therapy way. And I wrote down equanimity, and then I'm like, wait a second. Sure, psychedelics have trained a whole lot of equanimity in me, but when I look back at it, it's really something I was working on a lot before, and it was really important for being able to navigate it. Like you said, Steve, if I hadn't have had a very dedicated, disciplined meditation practice at the time, to have such a jarring realization and shift in path, I might have just been crippled by the anxiety of like, oh no, what will business partners think of me, like changing my course? Or I might have just been stuck in an anxious way in a certain path because I didn't have that. It's like one of my favorite many meditation teachers, Shinzen Young, talks about like the state of mindfulness that psychedelics can occasion, or practices can occasion. You get sensory clarity, you get more attention focused on something. But if you don't have equanimity, that blows up in your face. It's overwhelming. Like, you need to have a container to hold that rumble that might ensue from entering or going down that rabbit hole.
What is equanimity in your definition? Because as I'm listening to you talk, I'm wondering if there's like this general misconception that equanimity is like a peacefulness amongst it all, but my experience is that equanimity does not mean that you feel less or are at all detached from the feelings. Like, it is a quality of mindfulness, this ability to notice the moments. The moments are the roller coaster of emotions that is human life, and hold it all and not let those drive you, but to just observe them more and be present. But I'm curious about what you're saying with equanimity.
Yeah, that would be my favorite way of describing it too, is just broadening the container, one way of looking at it, to be able to hold anger and love at the same time, fear and compassion, or to be able to slip into that witness consciousness, not get so caught up in the thinking mind, and ride the wave of it without it being overwhelming, or without getting just swept away by that wave. Like, learning to surf the big feelings, or learning to hold it all at the same time. Like Ram Dass might call it, to be able to be form and formless at the same time, but you're not detaching. That's a really important point. You're not numbing, like, or ignoring the emotion. Yeah,
I had a fun thing along those lines come up recently. We just broke the mic, Jamie, sorry, and it was this lived experience of wanting something so bad, just having this deep, deep desire and feeling it on almost the level of overwhelmment and pain. And at the same time, being unattached to the outcome, like trusting the process while still having that burning desire. It was kind of a cool duality I felt like I was finally able to embrace.
I wonder if unattachment is different than detachment in this discussion about equanimity. I might just be making stuff up, but it's kind of the way I thought about it, is the riding the wave, knowing that it's a wave. Because sometimes if we can be on the wave and, I guess, I'm going to go all over the place, but like tumble in the wave, oh no, I am sad, instead of I'm feeling sadness. I'm feeling sadness seems a little more equanimous than I am sadness, like I am sad.
And I love the word equanimous.
It's fun. Ever since I learned it, I just try to use it as much as possible.
But the Buddhists would call it non-attachment. And I think it's a good distinction. Like, non-attachment as one of those enlightened principles to embody that's tied to equanimity. but you're not dissociating from it. You're not numbing or necessarily detaching. It's like another Ram Dass quote, do whatever it is that you do in life, just do not take the other person out of your heart. You know, you may need to speak truth that's uncomfortable to someone else or follow your unique dharma, but as long as you're keeping that open heart in hell, or that smile of unbearable compassion, he's got lots of ways of looking at it, then that's like the equanimity. That's the holding it all, or staying open through the difficulties.
Yeah, all is permitted. That wide container you're talking about. Equanimity involves willingness to experience whatever is there, and allows for like that divergent thinking. When we are not necessarily attached to whatever shows up, then we are free to think or do or experience something else.
This is a change of subject, but you know, another way some people have used psychedelics for non-therapy is dolphin communication.
Indeed.
I'm thinking specifically about John Lilly, but that's a whole fascinating topic. He was a ketamine pioneer, invented sensory deprivation tanks. But when Hannah and I were at a conference in San Francisco last fall, we went to this dinner and sat next to this guy who heard what we do for work, and, you know, as people do, really perk up and want to talk about it. He was a documentary filmmaker, made some like important piece of work, but now he was focused on understanding dolphin communication. And psychedelics were part of that path. It's just I bring it up because there are like the Nobel Prizes and the art and creativity. Like, people have used these tools for divination, for their, like, as religious sacraments, right? For shamanic rituals.
Yeah, and to make octopuses more pro-social and less introverted, and to make spiders create weird webs. I've ever seen that documentary of like the spider that was given LSD made like a really, I guess, creative web, and then the spider that was, I can't remember all the different drugs, but some of them were pretty lazy webs, some of them were very scattered. Yeah. And
there's one quote that ever since I saw it, I've been trying to figure out what it means, and maybe you have an answer. But this is from a Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia episode on ketamine, where Hamilton goes to visit this old fella in the desert who's a ketamine psychonaut, and he communes with angels while on ketamine, and he does art, angel art, and things like that. But in that episode somewhere it says, synesthese so you don't amnese. Riddle me that one.
It's one of my favorite quotes that I don't understand. But I really do love that quote.
Yeah. I mean, maybe crossing senses helps us. I'm going to just be weird about this. Crossing senses, synesthesia, helps us remember. Yeah. Helps us remember in really important ways. Like, remember who we are, what we're capable of, what it means to be human, what is consciousness. People talk about psychedelic experiences being an awakening of what was already there, or experiencing these past life regressions. And again, I'm not declaring that any of these things are actual or true, but yeah, I love the idea of synesthesing so that you don't anesthese.
I know, I love it so much, but it's also about making connections, right? Making connections that maybe you previously were not aware were connected, like this smell and this note that's coming out of the speaker right now. So I think that's maybe another part of that is becoming aware of the interconnectivity of things that maybe you weren't in normal waking state.
Yeah, I remember hearing John Hopkins talk about his Music for Psychedelic Therapy album, that he composed it for ketamine and used ketamine to compose it. Almost like this was his divination of ketamine's musical signature. And then for one of my own ketamine treatments, I listened to that album during my ketamine experience, and I felt like I was communing with the molecule. It was really weird. Wow. So yeah, maybe he pulled something, put something out of there with his creative connections.
All this stuff we've been meandering through of ways of using psychedelics for consciousness expansion, I think is kind of summed up by, there's an alarm. I think is kind of summed up by the transpersonal psychology field, or this idea of, and it's one that resonates with me, and we've all taught it together a lot, like the importance of a transpersonal experience in not just mental health conditions, but in life. And when I pulled up today the 7 characteristics of a mystical experience from the transpersonal psychology literature, it kind of sums up a lot of these, like mystical internal unity, like that experience of pure awareness, direct experience. External unity, oneness or unity with others. How important is that for how we get along as humans on this contentious planet? The noetic quality, like the sense of knowing. Sacredness, like, reclaiming or deepening your spirituality, whatever that is to you. Positive mood, or contentment, like it's all okay even though it's hard. Transcendence of space and time, because we get so caught up in time and anxiety and future tripping and rehashing the past. And then ineffability, just this beautiful characteristic of that experience that can't be described because it's too beautiful and we don't have words for it. I think that kind of encompasses a lot of these.
Yeah. Yeah. Hannah, anything to conclude with? Any thoughts that are bouncing around in your head that you want to share about psychedelic use for non-medical uses?
Yeah, maybe just the last thing that I feel like we didn't touch on a whole lot is like what even is pathology? Like we all have patterns, and some of those work to help us reach our goals and some of them don't. But I do think that that's another thing that psychedelics are good for is increased awareness of those patterns. And then like we did talk a lot about the psychological flexibility. In other words, this ability to see a new pathway and choose again. And since you quoted all this Timothy Leary, I mean, one of the things that he talked about was during LSD, especially around the peak of the experience, it's this real vulnerable open time where he believes that people are primed for imprinting whatever kind of new beliefs or ways of being that they'd like to. And so maybe that's just my final thought, is that recognition of patterns and this opportunity to imprint a new one.
Love it. Let's let Hannah have the final word. Those were beautiful words.
Good chatting with you both.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.